reflect the diverse practices and research interests of our graduate students. The various guests will speak from their experiences in research in various subject areas, such as repressed historical narratives and the creation of counter-narratives, counter-publics and the imagining of new social futures, weather and indigenous cultural practices, food and extractivism, various forms of visual social transformation, artists' moving image and bad animation, and curatorial politics and representation. So all of these events take place here in the main hall in the Daniels Building at 1 Spadina Crescent. Before we start, I'd like to share a few thoughts on land and place. So these are concepts that have been at the forefront of my thinking in the past as I've worked with artists and students thinking critically and responsively about place. As someone who grew up here in Toronto, moved away for a long spell and then returned, it has taken on many new meanings and urgencies. So I'd like to think about what we mean with any form of acknowledgement. As Layli Long Soldier, an Oglala Lakota poet, writer, artist, and activist, has so importantly written in her poem titled 38, everything is in the language we use. To acknowledge means to move towards, add knowledge. So since we know that policies of settler colonialism and genocide continue around the world as well as within Canada today, I wonder what we will do with this knowledge that we're moving towards. What does it mean to acknowledge land, to acknowledge place? How can we do that with the specificity of language? Not metaphorical language, but real concrete language. And I'm thinking here of the excellent text by Tuck and Yang called Decolonization is Not a Metaphor. And I would be remiss to ignore the specific building that many visual studies classes are in, and that my office is in. Here we have a very powerful pairing. On the one hand, we share this building with the First Nations House in Indigenous Studies. On the other hand, we have the history of this building as the home of Board and Dairy. Board and Dairy funded many of the nutritional experiments conducted at residential schools. So when we talk about place and land and acknowledgements, it's not enough to put the generic U of T acknowledgement on a syllabus or as a footer in an email and call it a day. We need to be specific. Everything is in the language we use. So thank you for gathering here today on this land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous peoples from across Turtle Island, and I am grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land with Indigenous community members. I also acknowledge that Toronto is covered under Treaty 13 and operates under the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt, a mutual agreement between the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe nations for sharing land and resources. And again, from Layli Long Soldier's poem, the memorial for the Dakota 38 is not an object inscribed with words, but an act. Now I would like to invite, well, first I'll introduce them, but I'd like to introduce and then invite our speakers for tonight. So, cooking sections who we're all here to see tonight, Alan Schwartz and Daniel Pascal Fernandez. Their bio is really long, so bear with me here while I will cut some of it live. They told me I was allowed to. So cooking sections investigates the systems that shape the world through food, tracing the spatial, ecological, and political legacies of extractivism. Using site-responsive installations, performances, and video, their practice confronts the overlapping boundaries of art, architecture, ecology, and geopolitics. Founded in London in 2013 by Daniel Fernandez Pascual and Alan Schwab, cooking sections deploy food as both a lens and a tool to expose landscapes of exploitation, ecological breakdowns, and the metabolic inequalities underpinning global food systems. Since 2015, they run Climavore, a long-term, site-responsive project exploring how to eat as humans change climates and how to metabolize climate breakdown. As I said, it's a long bio. Their work has been exhibited internationally, including at Tate Britain, Serpentine Galleries, SALT, Bonners Kunsthal, Carnegie Museum of Art, Royal Botanic Edinburgh, Storefront for Art and Architecture, among others. They have credited site-specific performances and installations for the Taipei Biennial, the 58th Venice Biennale, the Istanbul Biennial, Performa 17, Manifesta 12, Los Angeles Public Art Triennial, Sharjah Architecture Triennial, and New Orleans Triennial, among others. Residencies include the Headland Center for the Arts, Fogo Island Arts, and Delphina Foundation. Elon and Daniel are readers in architecture and spatial practice at the Royal College of Art, London, where they lead Climavore X Jamil at the RCA. They are fellows at the Canadian Institute for Advanced Research. Maybe they'll say something about that today. And I'll just really quickly mention that cooking sections they were nominated for the Turner Prize in 2021, received the special prize at the 2019 Future Generation Arts Prize, and were nominated for the Visible Award for Socially Engaged Practices. Daniel was awarded the 2020 Harvard GSD Wheelwright Prize for being shellfish. They have authored 3 books: The Empire Remains Shop, Salmon, A Red Herring, and Offsetted. Now, just really quickly, I'll just say, I met Alana and Daniel when I was on Fogo Island with 8 undergraduate students from the University of Toronto's Visual Studies Department. And I promised them that we'd make something happen. They are here because of that. And I promised them this because not only is their practice super rich, urgent, dealing with things that we need to be discussing, looking at the things that are underpinning our food practices now, but also they were extremely generous with their attention, with their listening, with their inquiries with our students. And I knew it was one of those things where there's a good reason why they're at the RCA doing what they're doing. They are good at their practice, they are good at pedagogy, they are just good. So I'm hoping you will welcome them with me tonight. Thank you.
Thank you for having us. For the very generous introduction, what you just heard is a Turkish song called Tiridine Bandim. Tiridine Bandim is a popular folk-like song, it tells the surreal story of a buffalo perched on a tree branch and its calf caught by a fly. In Turkey, it's been sung for over a century, usually at celebrations with its catchy and tongue-twisting lyrics, sparking joy and laughter every time. In 2022, this song as well became the heart of Manda Festivali, the water buffalo festival that we launched in the ruins of post-mining wetlands on the northern outskirts of Istanbul. But the festival, the Manda Festivali, isn't just about song and dance.
It's an invitation to remember, to celebrate, to wallow, to stick one's hands and feet in the mud. Over decades, Istanbul outskirts have been scarred, terraformed by mineral and financial extraction. A series of pharaonic developments have been carving into the wetlands. Roads, the runways of Europe's largest airport, bridges, embankments, and canals, all displacing water buffalo and the herders that rely on them. Manda Festivali, Manda in Turkish water buffalo, aims to care for these disappearing wetlands, keeping all the residents and companions in place. On April 27, 2011, Turkey's president announced the construction of a shipping canal measuring 31 kilometers, cutting across a narrow piece of land when Europe meets Asia. The ambitious plan aimed to bypass the Bosphorus Strait, a free water passage that has long allowed Black Sea oil and Ukrainian steppe grain to feed European and American markets without tolls.
Shipping shortcuts like these are nothing new. They have long capitalized on faster flows from Suez to Panama, from the Volga Don to the St. Lawrence Seaway, and such crossings, in a way, have been designed to accelerate global commodity flows. But they've also sped up transcontinental ecological exchanges, welcoming different species from place to place. And here you can see some of the plans for this new canal that would cut across the wetlands in Istanbul, connecting both seas. These new species, in a way, are new arrivals that range all over the world, from the Indian mackerel that has been moving from the Red Sea into the Mediterranean, or the Atlantic tarpon moving from the Caribbean into the Pacific, or zebra mussels from the Caspian Sea into the Great Lakes.
These new arrivals, known as the Lessepian migrants after Ferdinand de Lesseps, the diplomat behind the Suez Canal, have reshaped ecosystems, triggering symbiotic and chemical rearrangements of the world. If built, Canal Istanbul could similarly accelerate the Caspianization of the Mediterranean or the tropicalization of the Black Sea. But the so-called nation-building project fictions does more than rerouting waters. It cuts across thriving post-industrial ecologies outside Istanbul, encroaching on the spaces of its keystone residents, the wallowing water buffalo, bringing them closer to extinction.
To wallow is to disturb wet soil in order to kick up dust, to invite parasite-eating birds, offer frogs a ride, or feed dung beetles. And that's what buffalo do to stay cool, healthy, and keep their surroundings alive. Organisms are soil, and by getting dirty, buffaloes nourish a multi-species community that literally uses the muck to nourish and thrive while cohabiting, designing, digesting, decomposing, cannibalizing, and caring for each other. Disruption of interconnected webs and processes results then in unprecedented metabolic cascades.
At the same time, for humans to wallow is to indulge in an unrestrained way for grief, joy, or pleasure, like uninhibited singing and dancing to a buffalo song. In the outskirts of Istanbul, wallowing allows us to resist displacement from canal digging. Wallowing to keep wetness in place. Wallowing to encourage humans to dig in. Wallowing to sense and understand why murky terrains are vital. Wallowing to coexist with rotting, decomposing systems. Wallowing to sink your hands and feet into the soil. Wallowing is not just an ecological function. Here, it is used as a method, a strategy, a framework, a political tactic.
Because draining wetlands bogs or moors or swamps or marshes, peatlands or tidal floods are all also not about just loss. It is actually a violent act, an exemplary extractivist activity that draws lines where there were none, a way to designate clear boundaries, to divide land and water, zones and margins, to clear space for profit and to create profitable space. An incredible loss at incredible speed.
Just in the last 300 years, a fourth of the world wetlands have disappeared. Istanbul wet landscapes are no exception, shrinking dramatically since the Ottoman times. Yet despite cycles of extractions, the wetland remained terraformed, yet inhabited. Pastoralist communities, shaped by waves of Balkan migration and forced displacement from Bulgaria, Bosnia, Albania, and the 1923 population exchange with Greece, have made the muddy peripheries their home. The wetland herders, each with their diasporic histories, have fed and shaped Istanbul for generations, providing food, fuel, materials, and capital to shelter a growing population, even as they have been subjected to relentless improvements and water control operations.
Surface waters channeled, fertile soils drained, sand dunes dug, carbon deposits mined. Built were the aqueducts, the canals, water towers, pumping stations, quarries, timber yards, train tracks, and open pit mines. But by the mid-20th century, many of these infrastructures around the city were abandoned. The mines filled with rain and groundwater, creating over 2,000 acres of new water bodies and seasonal ponds.
Amidst these ruins, the buffalo continue to wallow, stomping their hooves, rolling in the dust, drooling on grasses, creating wallows that sustain habitats, species above and below ground. Birds follow buffaloes. Mammals follow birds. Together, they've made Istanbul's wetlands a crucial stop on the African-Euro-Asian migratory flyway. But in 2011, the Canal Istanbul master plan arrived like another wave of unprecedented development, extraction, extinction. Villages were rezoned into urban land, a blank canvas for real estate speculation and offshore investments.
Göllerimiz vardı doğal. Bu gölleri normalde kimse dolduramaz ama havaalanı kendi bölgesine girdiği için gölleri doldurdu. Ne bileyim bu gölleri doldurduğu zaman bizim hayvanlarımız oraya gittiği zaman işte meramız olduğu için ve göller de meralarda olduğu için hayvanlar biliyorlar çünkü dünkü hayvanlar değil bunlar. 30 senelik 40 senelik soy. Yani oralarda büyümüş, oralarda yetişmiş hayvan.
Despite Istanbul's opposition to central government plans, the projected waterway of Canal Istanbul was accompanied by a vision for 500,000 homes, a marina, a container port, a logistics hub, bridges, subways, and rail wards, all carved along spectral channel through the wetlands. Although the canal itself has been broken ground, it has already achieved its goal: to drain wetlands and life from Istanbul peripheries, especially in the plots of land adjacent to the future canal, even if their waterfront hasn't yet been made. Financial speculation drives investment before or regardless of whether the canal is built and the herders are being displaced due to rising land prices.
Wallowing, however, resists this logic. Mud does not reflect like a mirror. It's murky and messy, and that's its strength. Where land cleared for speculation projects a glossy, imagined future, mud instead roots us in the present. Speculation, from the Latin speculo, to mirror, is a technology of imagination, a way of accumulating capital by envisioning profitable futures built on margins. Canal Istanbul is precisely that, a political and financial mirage projected onto a drained wetland fantasy. through eminent domain and rezoning codes, land grabs. These technologies of the imagination have transformed the post-mining wallows into sacrificed, wastelandable areas ready to be built and primed for extraction.
Without grazing commons, herders are forced to buy both fodder and water for buffalo. This reduces their profit margins, creating higher dependencies on middlemen. Lack of access to land translates into herders being priced out. Less than an hour from Turkey's financial center, entire landscapes, wetlands, herders, buffaloes have been literally co-modified into extinction. But the Manda Festivali tells us a different story. A political gathering, a tool for buffalo diplomacy. To celebrate mud as a substrate for vital decomposition. As the last herds of fugitive buffalo struggle to hold ground, they continue to wallow, graze, bathe, and trample in abundant coal mines. Ecologies encouraging wetland residents to reimagine collective action, to keep herders' villages alive, to enable many species to thrive, to build food belts that provide ecological sustenance.
Pişta malame bikebut, biri malame bikebut. Pişta malame bikebut, biri khanye bikebut. Melki mawti harajur, melki mawti warajur. Damcin dira dabram, damcin dira rabnam. Wabkina qazya qurud, amma namma 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 kucherem. Amma namma kucherem, tebqul ana kamberem. Atmışız kol esmerem, piştamadan dindiri. Amma namma 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 kucherem. هاي أسقربان بتشيم
June 1st, bright blue sky, scorching sun. It's the day to celebrate the third edition of Manda Festivali. People gather for walks. Led by local herders, festival goers step out beyond the festival grounds, following buffalo footprints through the wetlands. Step by step, as their feet press into the soft ground, they listen. They hear first-hand stories of how Istanbul's pastoralist wetlands remain active. Spaces where water buffalo still graze, stomp, and restore wet grounds. Because the more they wallow, the more wallows appear. Istanbul's not an isolated case. Worldwide, buffalo are reintroduced to rebuild cultural liminal habitats and restore ancestral pastoralist ways of life. To wallow in all those places is to challenge binaries of urban and rural, dry and wet, native and invasive, natural and post-industrial.
Manda Festivali is itinerant. Each year, it moves between different villages, connecting territories fragmented by speculation, transport infrastructure, and real estate. Land is in constant financial flux, cutting herding corridors with runways, concrete, asphalt, and embankments. Amongst these new landscapes of colossal earthworks, infrastructure, and landfill operations, even the enormous scars of former mine pits appear tiny. Istanbul's topography has been scaled and rescaled through constant layering of extraction and expansion. Last year, festivals took place in Ajla, one of the last villages clinging to its wetlands, just east of the airport, its cliffs overlooking the Black Sea. Planes roared overhead every few minutes. A steady stream of quarry trucks rumbled by. Yet Ajla is also home to sustained resistance. It is the only wetland village to reclaim part of its commons. Here, local politics drive environmental resistance. Ajla's Mukhtar, the local mayor, the village recently worked with a botanist to map the endangered habitats of sand daffodils, using their findings to block further construction and expropriation of village lands.
In this context, and against this resistive backdrop, Manda Festivali does more than celebrate the buffalo. It builds on years of collaboration with herders and environmentalists to counter-speculate, to experiment with strategies and narratives that enhance emergent ecologies of post-mining pastoralism. To ensure the pastures are safe, milk tests also have been conducted to check for heavy metal contamination in the topsoil where buffaloes actually graze. And indeed, these disturbed landscapes function well for grazing, where pioneer grasses that may root quicker than the endemic ones are kept at bay, while rebuilding soil for future ecologies to thrive. Every year, the festival grows out of regular conversations reimagining the wetland terrain at coffee houses, at shops, kitchens, fields, where day-to-day politics also unfold and take shape. Practical decisions on the festival require discerning where it will take place, next to which wallows, where should people walk, which areas require more public attention, who should the visible face of the event be, in which place should buffalo and herders be portrayed together, which stories need to be told, and who should actually be telling them.
Like mud, this process can prove slippery. It demands flexibility to navigate community uncertainties and to negotiate with local authorities. The festival works both as a methodology and an environmental tactic. It reconnects people's appetite for buffalo milk desserts with the need to preserve a disappearing provenance that makes those desserts possible. Ultimately, it aims to reclaim the pastoral commons, not as a romanticized natural site, but as a dynamic post-industrial landscape.
Through wallow walks and bird sightings, billboards and flyers, mapping workshops and herder bazaars, public tastings and buffalo melodies, Manda Festivali invites you to joyfully wallow in the mud, to build common ground on the ruins of formerly mined and recently financialized landscapes.
Istanbul's wetlands face deeper contradictions. Some of the water bodies are officially classified as coastal freshwater lagoons, but flooded mine pits are excluded from the waterscapes designation as they are not natural enough to be preserved as nature. This means human-made wetlands were never fully granted official status or environmental protection, and yet they have the power to circumvent legal, political, and ecological loopholes.
Walking through Ajla's shared pastures is in a way, it's a way to see how herders collectively manage this space. But also it's a place where festival goers encounter steep, uneven residual topography, unattractive for anything else of value. Under Ottoman law, land deemed unproductive, like forests, deserts, or swamps, was classified as mevat, wasteland or lifeless lands. Mevat zones were later redefined and made available as mera, grazing commons for farmers and herders. And the remains of such classifications still linger in the landscape, but the idea of a wasteland as such in the modernist project of improvement is often shaped by what it lacks instead of what it is. A wasteland, in that regard, lacks food, water, people, cities, buildings, settlements, or farms. And it is this absence what makes it easy to claim, transform, settle, colonize, and erase.
The same is true in Istanbul. The surviving grazing pastures, often dismissed as wastelands, are amongst the easiest lands to annex for new developments. People, nonetheless, find hacks. As an alternative to classified herding areas, many guide their buffaloes to wallow in the buffer zones around the airport. These unprofitable margins, spaces too small or too sensitive for large-scale construction, embed both uselessness and possibility. They remain vital hotspots for grazing, sustained through informal agreements where security concerns, land access, and ecological maintenance bring multiple actors together.
Romani ha Romani haylola o Romani Romani ha Romani de gidila o Romani Romani ha Romani haylola o Romani Romani ha Romani de gidila o Romani Telli ani haylola o Romani Telli ani de gidila o Romani
Each herding household tends 50 to 100 buffalo. Herders sell their milk through middlemen to city retailers and residents, where it is transformed into dishes like sütlaç, which is a type of rice pudding, muhallebi, like a type of milk pudding, yogurt, or kaymak, which is close to clotted cream, so to say. These wetland foods, we could say, bridge the gastro-political divide, linking urban centers with muddy peripheries, but also making new forms of culinary values and metabolic chains. Istanbul's iconic muhallebici, which are the traditional dessert shops serving buffalo milk puddings, are at the heart of these transurban relations. These type of shops, which some are actually dating back to the 10th century, are the sites to prepare quintessential recipes and also have been run by a diversity of residents from Bulgarians, Albanians, Greeks, and also Turks themselves, which were always strangers, or were strangers and lovers of all genders. People from all possible walks of life have long gathered there from breakfast till late at night. And these spaces also have characteristic marble tabletops, which give sense of cleanliness. They also have mirrors covering the walls that allow one to gaze into other people's plates, and sometimes also share more than just desserts.
From the 1920s to the 1950s, muhallebici shops flourished, reaching over 200 establishments and street vending stalls. Wetland foodways found their way deep into Istanbul's cosmopolitan and diasporic classes. But today, only a few shops still source milk from Istanbul's muddy outskirts. Eating these beloved desserts depend on the flooded landscape, just as much as the wetlands depend on the muhallebici to stay afloat.
And to amplify these connections, the festival relied on çamuralem, which comes from the Turkish word çamur, the space to wallow in the mud. And çamuralem was a contemporary reinterpretation of a muhallebici shop in the heart of the city, which we opened in 2022 for the Istanbul Biennial. Here, people could literally get a taste of the wetlands through some of these 1,000 pots that we specifically made from clay from the wetlands. And each pot left behind a small little void in the ground, a new spot for buffalo to wallow. These wetland clay vessels, now used as food containers, invite the public to eat what emerges naturally from the mud. çamuralem is more than just a muhallebici place to eat. It's a space for activating awareness among local politicians, decision makers, and city residents. Together with the festival, they both make the disappearance of the grazing commons visible and perhaps even palatable to people who often wonder why buffalo milk desserts have become rare or unaffordable. And at çamuralem, encroached ecologies become something that you can see, listen, and taste, while the pots themselves contribute to creating new wallows to wallow.
For many people, tasting creamy kaymak or biting the burnt crust of sultach stirs deep nostalgia, childhood memory of comfort food tied to landscapes they may have never seen. This year's Festival's Bazaar proved how powerful these connections remain. Sellers sold out quickly, appealing to children and elders, political figures, and curious city dwellers alike.
Ήταν και χέρβα μαζί σου. Έχει βουβά, σέρες λίτκα. Κι ζυγό που κι παρέσει.
Festivals have long been spaces for subverting social norms. They offer moments of exception where routines pause and celebrations open new possibilities to transgress power. Where structures and other forms of carnivals to rites of passage, from pagan dances to religious processing, festivals invert authority and subjects, embrace cross-dressing and crossing class, feasting and gluttony, intoxication and hallucination, lust, desires, and bodily flesh.
Manda Festivali is not just about touristification or folklorization. It's about the presence and permanence of pastoralist ways of life. Unlikely alliances between herders, chefs, and municipal workers, sometimes even local police, come together to imagine or reimagine inventive temporary uses of the land, unusual encounters with the other. In this way, the festival acts as a counter-speculation of Canal Istanbul. It offers a different kind of future imaginary, one that reclaims the herding commons and the rehab of wet prairies, situating buffalo and herders as key agents in keeping food heritage and ecologies alive. And in so doing, it builds on old and new social, ecological, and Epicurean exchange.
Along the city, large-scale images of Istanbul's buffaloes and herders stare back from bus stops, walls, fences, and billboards. These street surfaces render them visible by projecting the wetlands back towards the city. These intimate human-animal portraits became part of an expansive visual campaign, a celebration of pastoralist practices and trans-species cohabitation.
Drawing from agricultural traditions while subverting the beauty pageant format, which is what one would see in some of these village festivals, the Manda Festivali instead organized a water buffalo and herder portrait competition, the two together. A live jury awarded bespoke buffalo bells in categories like Best Duo, People's Vote, Buffalo Charm, and Best Wetland Defender to the photographs. The portraits challenged Istanbul's visual backdrop of political campaigns and real estate ads of Canal Istanbul in the same area by bringing the muddy wetlands back to where they once were, but into the city's gaze. Over 3 editions of the festival, ownership and participation in Manda Festivali have evolved. Herders and local stakeholders increasingly take pride in the event. For the 3rd edition, the local municipality provided display surfaces, shuttle buses, and shade canopies in kind. And they even produced their own promotional video and managed to bring 2 political leaders from 2 different parties, opposing parties, together on stage, which is quite a rare occurrence within the current political climate.
The event celebrated a collective sense of pride amongst herders who saw themselves portrayed across their city, performing them labor that is often invisible. Recent outcomes included a municipal announcement to establish a working group with herder representative and a meeting with Istanbul mayor to figure out how to preserve roaming buffaloes and support the wetlands as critical spaces for local food economies.
Through participatory mapping workshops and wallow walks, Manda Festivali became also more than a festival. It was, for us, more space for co-producing knowledge. Before, during, and after each event, the herders themselves engaged in closed sessions with planning authorities, environmental organizations, and other stakeholders who are essential for carrying forward the festival's legacy into next year's edition. And this is also the place where the herders voiced their struggles, how policies constrained their ability to access grazing lands, and how the wetlands are enclosed, grabbed, drained, privatized. Together, they mapped out former and current wallows, identifying grazing routes, and marked areas under threat.
This mapping isn't just cartographic. It's an act of resistance. It creates opportunities for encounter, political negotiation, and public visibility. Wallowing itself is that mapping process, by literally sinking into the mud and understanding which land dries and floods, how and when. This embodied knowledge on species and wetness turned into a shared methodology to track soil health, plant growth, land use and abuse, and ultimately rain-fed pasture restoration and preferred grazing corridors. Making such corridors available would contribute not only to stitch village back together, but also to give opportunity of choice for the buffaloes to graze as they please. This work has expanded into a knowledge tool that facilitates conversations across diverse residents and audiences, as well as assisted in the projection of a potential future scenarios. Created after the 2023 festival, the baseline report was shared with stakeholders and policymakers in Istanbul's municipality, aligning with the city's new food build strategy.
Manda Festivali didn't just focus on human alliances. It seeks to collaborate with the more than human residents of the wetlands. Post-mining wetland habitats are shaped not only by human decisions, but by the buffalo and their multispecies friends.
Buffalo fertilize grasses where their saliva and manure.
Manure, in turn, nurtures earthworms.
Earthworms open channels to connect isolated puddles.
Puddles attract insects.
Insects attract shrimp, fish, and frogs.
That turn puddles into wallows.
And wallows into thriving ponds.
And ponds support birds that nest around the wallows and feast on parasites living in their skin. An intricate interwoven system that suddenly makes the song Tiridine Bandim, with which we started, all very logical to us.
The festival highlights these exchanges, commonalities, and dependencies, while also building new political alliances. It connects struggles for environmental justice, food security, and the dynamic preservation of culinary and cultural heritage. Long-term collaborations were forged with chefs, restaurants, and cooking schools, environmental groups, climate activists, and nature enthusiasts. Herders exchange histories and stories, ancestral and day-to-day life with pastoralists from other protected wetlands, like those in the Samsun Delta, who share their own challenges, environmental tactics, and experiences.
Manda Festivali also goes beyond celebration to building different longer-term strategies also for wetland survival. And among those, a new partnership with a local cooking school in Istanbul is now training the next generation of cooks to use wetland ingredients or wetland foods. This connection between culinary practice and ecological awareness encourages young chefs to value the wetlands and reimagine them not just as a source of ingredients, but also as an ecological, vibrant living system. And alongside this, the collaboration also has started with a new yogurt making facility that connects herders directly to people who appreciate their role in keeping the wetlands from being channeled or dug, but also starts a process to regain autonomy and counteract the speculative land economy pushing them out. Instead of selling their milk in bulk to middlemen without landscape-related value, this will translate into herders selling directly to consumers or small retailers, having more control, visibility, awareness raising, and bargaining power. While buffalo cannot be a long-term solution to a looming shipping canal and the land grabs that are still ongoing, these interventions in a way invite us to consider what else can prevent herders and wetlands from being priced out of existence, and how could we support grazing practices that also must prioritize animal welfare, ecological repair, and multi-species coexistence.
Wallowing, in this sense, becomes a method for political engagement. It creates liminal spaces where new social orders and land uses are reimagined, where everyday buffalo diplomacy, disruption, and celebration can unfold.
A public park became a stage for musical performances, food tastings, and herder buffalo portrait competitions.
A village coffee house hosts regenerative grazing workshops, opening up a traditionally male space to mix gender conversations on land action.
An enclosed pasture becomes a site of common sensing, ecological awareness, and shared understanding around the extinction of wetlands in the city, but also their buffalo and their people.
A village muhtar from one party hosted an official from an opposition group.
Billboards projected images of the wetlands with their pastoralist dwellers back into urban spaces where they were once pushed out, but also much, much more.
Against the backdrop of financial speculation, which exploits images of the future to generate real estate value, Manda Festivali seeks to collectively craft an alternative, non-extractive futurity where the different interests of birds, humans, grasses, earthworms, and buffalo govern and shape space. As the wetlands shifted from agricultural spaces to logistic hubs, military zones, mining sites, financial sinks, and targets of real estate speculation, the very soil beneath these landscapes were heavily commodified.
But the wallowing buffalo, right by Istanbul's airport, are revalorized as essential constituents of the post-mining wetland assemblage. The festival wasn't just a series of events. It's an act of slowing down land dispossession, of restoring pastoralist practices and disturbed ecosystems, of restoring new human-animal kinship narratives and forms of action. Wallowing then becomes a vehicle for producing post-mining pastoralist commons, not as something to be conserved, but as a set of spatial practices enhancing wet, muddy ecologies in constant evolution.
Φωνές και κλάματα άκουσα στη σκήπου το κομμάτι θαρώ, κουβάλια θαρώ, κουβάλια σφάτουζή.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. I'd also like to invite Chloe Gordon-Chow, one of our first-year MVS curatorial students, who will join us in this quick Q&A session that we'll do to sort of enter into the wider Q&A. We'll open things up to the audience for questions for Elon and Daniel. But first, thank you so much for that. That was great, and I appreciate you letting us wallow with you.
Is this on? Oh, yeah. Yeah, thank you so much. That was really beautiful. My first question was kind of, can you delve further into this tension where water buffalo and water buffalo kind of milk and the products in particular are also part of a nation building project and integral to the culture of Turkey, and kind of this tension then that they are under threat as a result of a very, very different nation building project that would then still claim water buffaloes and water buffalo milk as their own.
Yeah, no, I think it's a great way to start the discussion. Thank you for that question. Yes, it's very true, and I think there's a lot of contradictions there in kind of, on the one hand, how water buffalo products and water buffalo milk are kind of really quintessential kind of desserts and have been for centuries, and the use of buffalo milk has been very much kind of ingrained in the culture and kind of in culinary practices. And kind of its myth, in a sense, or kind of its allure very much still exists. But it is something that is disappearing more and more. So you still have like the president, which is the current president, Recep Erdogan, which is the person that is behind like digging the canal, a year ago came out with a statement saying how important like buffalo milk is and kind of buffalo milk desserts and how this is like Turkish food, etc., etc. And yet kind of finding these foods today, right, from the kind of landscapes which kind of their traditional landscapes and from the landscapes and kind of the practices that they support is becoming impossible. And also kind of the flavor, in a sense, and kind of the expectation is completely changing because over the past century, more and more cow's milk has been kind of mixed into the process. And today, it's really interesting, also when we work with the students in the culinary school, we kind of with them, they're like the chefs we work with, they make different tests, you know, and they make kind of the desserts with like 50%, you know, like cow, 50% buffalo milk. They make like only buffalo milk, only cow. And it's really interesting that kind of the taste of like pure buffalo milk is something that is like extremely foreign to people, right? And it's kind of their least kind of favorite taste. And of course, this is like also completely has to do with how our palate has been completely industrialized. So in a sense, it's kind of the whole project and the tension that you're alluding to is kind of really trying to kind of dig deep into the space and kind of to think about how spaces have been industrialized, how bodies of buffaloes have been industrialized, how our bodies have been industrialized, but also what happens in this moment of like post-industrialization in this particular space where there's a lot of abandonment that takes place because, you know, all of these mines that have been flooded as we were talking about.
And maybe to add another point around the question of the law, right? Because in some places where the rule of law can be not necessarily something that is fixed in stone, then what are also like talking to many environmental groups in different places is then what kind of tools do people have against displacement or being priced out, or well, you can apply it to gentrification and many other geographies. And then this is also when perhaps the land zoning or classification doesn't mean that is something secure even. And this is when also in conversation with different groups started coming out the idea, okay, so how do you use perhaps other tactic that is not depending on a legal definition, because that might change overnight, as we see in many countries around us. So then what other strategies could you put in place that perhaps activate other processes like celebration or something that creates more common ground among parties that are not necessarily agreeing on certain politics.
Yeah, it's a really interesting point, kind of thinking about how the festival would then facilitate kind of a development of a palate for this buffalo milk and kind of a reactivation of that, which might even be lost. I'm not sure, but I can imagine. And thinking about the palate as a form of embodied knowledge. It's really beautiful.
This might be a slightly different angle of things, but you talked a lot about restoring pastoral practices. And it got me wondering a lot about the history of the pastoral and about Arcadian myth and thinking through, like, you know, through the Renaissance up to Romanticism and even into like contemporary sci-fi, the pastoral is often projected as this utopia, but it's a utopia that's also one of unending, untapped resource. And it often ends up being, and has been traditionally, sort of instrumentalized as a way to think through future extraction. So I'm wondering what you can do with this project to also protect from that future idea of the pastoral being ascribed to it. Because it is, as you've described, like a very urgent thing to protect in a lot of ways. But how do we then avoid the sort of mythic utopian potential that leads to more extraction?
Yeah, it's a good question. Thank you. I think also because of people who know the site, or when people visit the site, the first thing that they will say is like, "Well, this is totally dystopian," because you have like massive planes flying above you. This is literally by the airport. You have abandoned mines, equipment, lorries carrying sand, like real estate development. It's like madness. So I think different from other contexts, I think here what is perhaps interesting is whether this can help us think of a different type of the pastoral or pastoralism that is not the bucolic, romantic English version of the 19th century for the upper class, but really something that is like dealing with the debris of society. And then yet you have these people that have been pushed out from many places, including this forced displacement during the population exchange between Greece and today's Turkey. So yeah, is a lot of like moving parts, very precarious. Also, there is no certainty of what can happen. People selling off their buffaloes as we speak because they see no future in it. So that's when we started thinking that perhaps also in terms of conservation, this does not fit in. We had it in one of the images, what is called the globally important agricultural heritage systems from the UN, for instance, that would protect the kind of ancient rice terraces in the Philippines. This does not fit in that category because it's like post-industrial, it's not natural enough, but it is a very interesting ecosystem. And then for us is the question, what kind of new paradigms could we think of that deal with this other type of post-mining pastoralism that do not fit in current conservation frameworks, and yet is like most of the landscapes we are surrounded by are not pristine anymore, not even these ancestral terraces that are full of agrochemicals. So yeah, I think from our perspective, there's a lot of potential to reimagine what the pastoral is from a much more, or from a perspective that deals more with toxicity, with like abandonment, etc., but also with a lot of hope of the possibilities that these places can offer.
Yeah, it's an interesting project to kind of disturb this idea of there's either kind of this binary of very pristine ecological lands or like an urban infrastructural cityscape, and to kind of reckon with the present moment that we exist within, that these are just intrinsically intertwined, is really thought-provoking. I wanted to ask a little bit more about the festival itself and kind of what drew you to this idea of hosting a festival, and to not just talk about the stakes of kind of what it would mean for these lands to be lost or for the water buffalo to disappear, but yeah, what drew you to something that is joyful and celebratory?
I think that's something that we've been coming back in with our practice over and over again, and has to do a bit with the methodology, I guess, in which we work. And and the fact that I think for us, with many projects, and particularly with the projects we do, like under the framework of Climavore, so the work we're doing in Skye around salmon farming, or the work we're doing currently in the south of Italy around drought seeds, in kind of the circulations of seeds that can resist drought, we kind of have been coming more like focusing a lot on this idea of like how culture, so on the one hand, how agriculture, we could claim is like one of the first cultures on earth, and yet today agricultural practices in current moment, culture has been completely like removed from the idea of agriculture, right? So there's like, agriculture has nothing to do with culture anymore, pretty much. And and I think then for us what becomes really interesting is to think about, as we work in the space of culture and we work a lot with cultural institutions, is how to use those platforms in a sense to bring back, or kind of to try to work with this idea of culture, and how to expand the notion of culture within agriculture. And all of this project started for the Istanbul Art Biennial, when we did Chambualem, the shop, and the foundation that runs, it's the Cultural Istanbul Foundation, they run all of the festivals for the city. So they have the art festival, which is the biennial, they have the theater festival, the classical musical festival, the jazz festival, and so on and so forth. And as we were doing all the research and preparing the project, we were like, yeah, the city also has to have a buffalo festival, why all of these, why theater and art and jazz and not buffaloes, right? It's really an integral part of the city and its history, and that's how it kind of came about, and how we used the biennial as a space to launch the festival. Since then, now the festival has grown and became its own kind of thing that operates in a completely different way and has nothing to do with the biennial and stands on its own. It's kind of led by conversations with the herders and so on and so forth. But it really kind of goes back to the idea that we come back to again and again is how do we use kind of cultural institutions, museums, biennials and so forth as platforms to kind of interject or kind of inject these questions into everyday moments in society.
And do you find it difficult, I feel like, some of the terminology like wallowing or mud even, or wastelands, to turn that into something that is sexy to people and that people care about? Do you find it hard to cross that divide, especially in the arts?
I find it very attractive, yes. Because it's something that in our head is something dirty, but it has to be dirty. And I think also we need to deal with, the world today, the planet is very dirty, and we need to start embracing toxicity. I think the binaries of clean and dirty are long gone. And if we live in a world of gradients of toxicity, that is something that is more or less harmful for the body or many bodies, then how do you live with these remains of industrialism?
But do you find that since so much of your work is fairly fundamentally interdisciplinary, there's often this sort of, these days in particular, there's this idea the interdisciplinary is this sort of apotheosis of practice, and it's always thought of in these really clean and pristine, we're going to have an expert from here and an expert from here, and we're going to consult them. But now you're presenting it as a productive muddiness, right, where the interdisciplinary can actually be a place of imprecision. And is this part of the sort of deeper methodology that you use, that that the interdisciplinary is there as a way to make mess?
Yes. I think also when we started with the project in Istanbul some years ago, this is where we say, okay, what is the cultural landscape of the buffaloes? And this one of the first intuitions was to approach an ethnomusicologist, Mustafa Afci, with whom we prepared this incredible playlist that he found all these different songs in Kurdish, Armenian, Bulgarian, Greek, and Turkish songs referring to buffaloes to first understand how long have the buffaloes been in people's imagination and cultural oral histories. And then also at the same time, okay, let's approach a botanist for them to make a reading of the grasses that buffalo depend on, and the other way around, because they fertilize the soil with their saliva as they graze. Then also we worked with an ornithologist that we asked her, Melissa Ball, to understand these dependencies between migratory birds and buffaloes. So I think, in terms of disciplines, also perhaps it was a process of approximation, as knowing that we lacked a lot of the knowledge, but okay, how do we understand all these multi-layered histories that relate to cultural processes, but also many actors. And we definitely don't have the knowledge, but through these conversations also have been building or an understanding of that muddiness, perhaps.
And I guess it's also enables this to become an ever expansive project somehow, and where kind of you're constantly faced by what you by what you do not know, and whenever you bring another interlocutor in, you're also faced by kind of the limitations of all the work that you've been doing until now somehow, and I think it's over how to make that into a productive kind of mode of inquiry or a kind of production or research, I think for us has been something that we've been returning to over and over again.
I think before we turn it over to the audience, I have one two-part, very important question. Can I get the playlist? And number two is the herder buffalo portrait competition. Are any of those portraits available to be seen? I would really love to see those.
Yeah.
Everything online, yes.
Yes.
So the playlist put together by Mustafa is available online with the lyrics and the portraits on our website. They're there. And we are now working on the next poster and visual campaign for the city for next edition. So there will be more soon.
Will there be a publication?
Perhaps. We haven't.
So yeah, at this point, I'd love to turn it over to the audience for questions. There's already a hand up. Do we have other microphones? Yes, we do. Thank you.
I just wondered, a defining feature of mud is that it's constantly moving and therefore alive. Once it stops moving, it turns to rock. And I wondered if you have thoughts about that feature of mud and how it informs the relationship herders have with mud, who also depend for their life on movement.
Yeah, thank you for the question. Yes, I think there's a lot of fluctuation also throughout the seasons in the outskirts of Istanbul. So, like vernal pools, right? They radically change the vegetation. Even within 10 centimeters, you have different flowers and 2 millimeters difference. So the mud gets dry and wet and dry and wet, and it changes every year. And being so dynamic also is what is interesting. It can even be dangerous. Once we had a colleague really stuck till here, and we couldn't get him out. So yeah, it has its dangers as well.
Yeah, but essentially, I think what for us has been always very interesting, kind of, and where a lot of the thinking around mud comes from, is the fact that the buffaloes are constantly roaming the space, right? And by the fact that the space, kind of these pastures are muddy, they're moving the mud, right? They're moving the soil, and kind of, as we've shown in different pictures, they're carrying different animals from one pool to another, right? And all of this kind of and worms and many different lives. So yes, I think it's all kind of, then the whole pasture becomes a very dynamic ecology.
Hi, thank you for the talk. I have a question about the festival. So you were saying that the government, maybe way later in the game, they provided funding, maybe transportations to the place. So how did you get through funding from the beginning to get things started?
Yes, that's always a very important question. So it started with the biennial. So we kind of made the first festival. We started through the art biennial basically, and it was kind of part of our installation budget. Also, went to make the festival, and over the years with making these projects, I think. Unfortunately, the reality is that fundraising becomes like a very big part of the work today. I think of many artists and practitioners, and we've with all of these different projects that I think for us we try to work beyond kind of the duration of exhibitions, because I think we're really interested in ecological practices and processes and the structures of what museums and kind of festivals, biennials can afford us doesn't allow for these kind of very long-term processes that might take like 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, and so forth. Then a lot of it becomes of like, how do you resource kind of this work? So today, like this project is supported by a foundation that we work with, and different projects kind of have different partnerships and kind of collaborations that make them happen.
Thank you. I so enjoyed that. So I'm Nehia Wak. I'm from the plains. So if you're familiar with the buffalo on the plains. So our very identity, when we introduce ourselves, we acknowledge that those Pascuamostus are truly our ancestors, but they are matriarchal civilizations. And so some of my research, this is what I'm looking at, around the matriarchs, around design, architectural design in particular. But I'm curious about if you've looked at that are these water buffaloes matriarchal?
That's a very good question. We're still trying to understand a lot of these relations, especially because in this particular area outside Istanbul is a place where many people have been pushed to. So it doesn't have such a long history as kind of what you're talking about. There is maybe it's like 1, maximum 2 centuries, perhaps, of inhabiting this particular place, and because it was an amalgamation of people being displaced from Albania, from Bosnia, from Greece, Bulgaria. So they, in a way, it's a conglomerate of approaches, and also every time we keep talking to people, and also each family has a very different approach depending on also their ancestry. As far as we understand it, doesn't seem to be matriarchal, but maybe for some families is. So far we haven't encountered it.
And I think it's a really interesting point also in the sense of how perhaps in the plains kind of buffalo shaped humans in many ways, right? And kind of there are many ways of life and patterns that are very much kind of influenced by migrations of buffaloes and the way they roam through the plains. And I think in the context of Istanbul, and this is like really particular, I guess, to the city also, the relationship between buffaloes and humans has been economic for like centuries. And these were kind of having a part of, they were kind of work, like they were used as like work mammals. They were used to like milk, to be milked, and so like for meat and so on and so forth. And they're I would say, more also domesticated. I mean, they're semi-wild, but they're still more domesticated than kind of the North American kind of plain, like buffalo or bison, which I think the way kind of they roam the land, etc., is of a very, very different scale and kind of a very different pattern. So I think there's like a lot to observe there, but also kind of the history and the context is radically different in many ways.
And then just a quick follow-up. I noticed in the photos that. I noticed in the photos that most of the herders are men, and then there was one photo of a woman who was with a buffalo.
Yeah, and it's a great point. And traditionally, the men were the herders, and the women did the milking, and kind of tended the animals kind of at home in a sense, and kind of processed the milk and so on and so forth. I think now there's a whole other layer that kind of has been added on top of that in the past kind of 10, 15 years, with kind of huge kind of migration of people kind of trying to enter Europe from Syria, Afghanistan, like Bangladesh, Pakistan. This is very, very close to the border of Europe. So you have like a lot of people kind of arrive to Istanbul and its periphery and kind of wait there to try and cross. And because of like, and a lot of these people that might have like pastoralist kind of traditions and knowledge end up working also with the buffaloes for short periods of time, and they can suddenly like disappear one day, and they then try to cross the border, and then 3 months later they might appear again because they've been caught and they've been kind of sent back and so forth. And that also has really changed the dynamic, like kind of the gender dynamics. And I think for many, many reasons that are quite complex, it's also kind of, and has to do also with like the history, like this gender norms within kind of Turkey society. Women are kind of being pushed more and more kind of away into the homes and kind of out of the buffaloes. So they're like, it's a very complex kind of geopolitical place as well that is influencing a lot kind of also gender kind of balance and dynamics. And
But then we have Mirai, and she's a hero, and she also she does both. She's both herder, and also she has a shop where she sells the dairy products from her own buffaloes. But it's a very, very unique case.
Hi, my name is Noah. I was wondering, when you first approached the project, how did you conduct your research? What were some methodologies that you employed?
Thank you. So that's a very long question. We'll try to simplify it a bit, because it's been like many years and many phases. The project first started as an invitation from SALT, which is a museum in Istanbul. And first we developed the initial conversations with the herders. Also, like, it takes a lot of time to build trust. And then the pots, the clay pots, were the first step. This is also where we started mapping out which muhallebici shops are left in Istanbul that still source the milk from the wetlands outside the city, which we could only find 3 in the whole of Istanbul. So then starting all these conversations, and the methodology in a way became more and more multi-layered, I would say, as we were moving along. Then for the biennial, we did another step, and this with the music, with the birds, the grasses, the water. And then after the biennial has been a whole other set of methodologies to actually work much more with grassroots organizations, but also the cooking school, a university, a dairy, a yogurt making company. So it's also adding as we go along. We keep adding depending on what is also needed, because on the one hand there is research going on, but also a lot of action, and they feed back into each other, I would say.
Thanks. That was a great presentation and whole thought presentation and world that you created for us. I was thinking a little bit about something that Gareth said about the sort of concern about pastoral and its association with utopia. It made me think a little bit about the historical formation of pastoralism, that it was a form of social distancing between an exploitative class and an aristocratic class, and its ability to gaze on a land of labor but it was also a moment when people still understood roots of wealth within the activities of the pastoral landscape, even though it was put at a distance. And I was thinking about the project that you've described, where you have created almost like a representational loop between an urban bourgeois that consume the products of the buffalo, that begin to see images of the landscape and the buffalo inhabit, and begin to understand a circle of consumption and mutual relations that are in part economic in nature on the one hand. But I'm wondering, on the other hand, that I wanted to ask you about is, I mean, it's possible to form a social solidarity around mutual dependence in the economic circuit, but you also have one in which you want people to mingle in a more community-based solidarity, I guess, through the festival. And I guess, I mean, I can see the projects as intertwined, but I could also see the economic one as the more powerful engine in terms of protecting the landscapes. And I wonder if this division makes any sense to you, or if they're just intertwined entirely.
Yeah, no, I think it's a great question. In kind of on a kind of conceptual level, yes, these things kind of, like, I agree that the kind of economic driver could be the thing that kind of creates like a certain way to preserve the landscape. I think what is interesting here in this particular case, and I think it's perhaps something that is also true to many kind of perhaps like post-industrial sites or kind of sites that emerges out of like ruins of like industrialism and capitalism, is that because these are like ruins, the same kind of modes of capitalist accumulation don't necessarily work. And here, because the landscape is so fractured and dismembered, and there are so few herders left and so few families that are still practicing it, they are never going to be producing like enough buffalo milk to feed a population of like one of the biggest cities in the world. And B, it's like also it can never, like, the way it cannot expand, there are like just like real limits of like how there's almost like keeping it as it is would be like a huge success. And then when you're trying to think, and this is like work that we're currently engaged with, is like, so what is the economic kind of model and economic driver in those situations, and how do you kind of create kind of basically business plans that are supporting modes of governance, for instance, and kind of modes of participation in something, and like economies of solidarity and kind of community building versus like economies of like building capital, right? Or kind of building like wealth accumulation. And I think there's like, it's a really interesting kind of paradigm in a sense where we kind of really try to think how are these two things come together, and that through acts like the festival and relationship with restaurants and kind of really building the notion of like cultural heritage around this, you can create a space where you enhance the practices, but essentially enable them to be kept in place. And what is enhanced through that is ecologies and kind of communities of multiplicity of species. Like, you're not working only for like humans and herders and like buffaloes, but you are working for like many, many different constituents, right? That are like deep in the ground and are in the water and are like in the trees and in the, it's like, it's all of it together.
Is there no one else? In that case, I just would ask you to join me in saying a big thank you to Alain and Daniel. That was fantastic. Thank you so much. And I just quickly want to tell everyone about the next MVS Pro seminar. It will be March 11th, and that's Jamila James, the Manilow Senior Curator from the MCA Chicago, who will be coming and delivering one of these as well. She's absolutely wonderful. Don't miss that one. And again, thank you to you both. Really appreciate that.